Thank you all so much for being here today. We are continuing with our School of Education Research Symposium series. And I'm very pleased today to have Dr. Christie McIntyre with us to talk about her research related to assessment tools. And her presentation is Beyond Rubrics, Continuums of Learning. Thank you, Christie.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I want to see who all we've got here. A few familiar faces. Awesome. Good to see all of you. Good. So I'll probably minimize this part of us so that we can see our screen as we go forward. Are we doing mask only or are we? Yeah. Okay. We'll keep mask on. Can you, I guess I should go back. Can you hear me okay? Let me check that before I start. You can hear me good? Okay. Here we go then. Minimize that one. So this began as a 4th or 5th session in a rubric workshop series that Dr. Karan and I did back in 2019, actually, and circumstances beyond our control prevented us from being able to finish the series with this final session. So we're adding it to our research symposium. And I'm thrilled to get to share some of this with you today. So coming at the end, I did want to bring a little context to what we had worked on previously. There we go. Just to kind of put us in a mindset today of what we're going to think about, what we're going to talk about, and look at. When we think about assessment, I'd like you to take just 30 seconds and just think in your mind, what comes to mind for you when you think about the word assessment? Evaluation, okay.
You can also type it in the chat if you'd like.
Scoring tools, okay. For me, when I think about assessment, I think about sometimes taking a snapshot of someone's progress and potentially putting a series of snapshots together to form what we typically call a portfolio or a group of moments in time that represent someone's growth over time. Some may say that assessment is a dialogue between the person doing the assessing, the assessor, and the one being assessed. And then some may think of assessment as the test process or looking at evaluation and getting feedback in that manner. Assessment has become one of those broader terms that, when we were looking at assessment and evaluation back 10 years ago, it was like, well, which one's above the other, assessment or evaluation? And we were constantly doing this business, thinking about which one's the umbrella and where does it fit underneath. And the conversation in the last 10 years has turned more towards, well, what is the purpose of what it is that you're assessing? What are you doing it for? At one point, 20 years ago, we would have talked about alternative assessments being a portfolio as opposed to a test. And it was as if everything was being compared to a multiple choice fill in the blank type test. But both can serve formative and summative purposes in the world of assessment. So when we think about assessment, it's not just what is assessment, but what is the purpose of assessment as well? And so here I take this point just a step further. We've got a picture of the Mona Lisa from Leonardo da Vinci. And as you think about how would you give feedback to Leonardo da Vinci on his work here? Would you give him a grade? Oh, I think that's about a C, Leonardo. I think you could do better. Would you pull out a rubric and rate his work? Oh my gosh, what a daunting task that would be, right? get a rubric and to say, well, on your choice of color, I think you could have gone this way or that way. Would you use a checklist? Or would you provide narrative feedback? You'd provide narrative. You'd have a conversation. You'd have a dialogue about what it is that you're seeing, what appears to be there or not there, what's present, what you're noticing. You'd give that person an opportunity to talk about their intent and what they were doing and trying to accomplish, and the iterations of what they went through to get to that place, right? So when we think about assessment, I always like to think about this notion of, if I had Leonardo da Vinci in my class and he painted the Mona Lisa, what would I do with that? What kind of feedback would I give him? And that's kind of where I want us to hold and suspend our thoughts today, and keep in mind that it is about the purpose of assessment. Okay. Seeing where I go to click. There we go. Okay. So again, I know there's got to be a way to make this little bar go away. One day I'll figure that out.
Actually, there's an easier way, I think, to do it, but you have to go back to share screen. So you have to stop sharing.
Oh, let's just move it up here for right now. Okay. Hide, no. Hide floating meeting controls. Whew, there we go. Good. Good job. Okay, we got it out of the screen. So continuing our thoughts about what is the purpose of assessment. And I want to just challenge us today. Is the purpose of assessment to validate the bell curve? Or is the bell curve just a natural outcome of our assessing? I've actually had conversations with colleagues who would argue that they need to make sure their grades reflect the bell curve, which means that we're serving the bell curve, we're not serving our students, right? So let's keep in mind what the purpose of assessment is. When we begin to look at rubrics, then I think about our bullseye up here. We've identified a target that we want our candidates to hit, our students to hit. And in each quadrant, we've identified elements or criterion that they need to demonstrate proficiency on. And so the rubric allows us to define what that looks like as they're moving towards their target. The bottom visual here is more about moving towards the notion of a continuum of learning. And that's to say that it's a lifelong process, that it's ongoing, that we build on prior experiences, knowledge, and skills, and that we just continuously merge forward into newer understandings or deeper understandings of the things that we know and can do. That's the thinking that's behind a continuum of learning, as opposed to thinking about some of our other assessments. The grade is going to tell us how they're performing compared to their peers. But we've already established the fact in our rubric workshops that a grade does not give the student the feedback they need to improve what they're doing or what they're about. Hence, we move to rubrics. Rubrics allow us to define our expectations and to define what we're looking for and what their performance levels might look like. Okay, so this is a typical outline setup for a rubric. Oftentimes in a rubric, we'll use qualifiers for our levels, such as exemplary, proficient, basic, unacceptable. We also often associate points with those. Why is it that we associate points within our rubrics? I've got two people here. Why do we put points in our rubrics? Anybody? I would contend we put points in our rubric to conform to the grades. We are, I'll suggest,
Our mindset is already established and set on how many points is worth this grade.
yes,
So because we already have the mindset, we
right,
don't want to take it out of the rubric
right,
because we want to continue on with the mindset.
yeah. We're trying to validate or support the grades that we put in a grade book that has to go to the registrar's office. Okay? Do you see what's wagging the dog? It's definitely the tail here. It's definitely the registrar's office, right? Because we feel compelled to quantify what has been an otherwise very qualitative reference to someone's work. Now, this then begins to translate. If we switch it one more time, we see the next focus becomes the letter grade. Really, in effect, when we do a rubric, we've identified if you want to get an A, this is what you'll do. If you want to get a B, this is what you'll do, a C and a D. Now, language is important here. When we talk about the difference in a rubric and a continuum of learning, notice the terms exemplary, proficient, basic, and unacceptable. We're going to come back around to these terms a little bit later, but hold these in your mind right now and think about what does that communicate to the student. It communicates what those grades say. A grade in our mind is a C, is minimum. It's basic. It's no frills, nothing extra. You've met the mark, and that's it. And then we began to look at more information and what would move somebody up to exemplary. And we consider a D or an F as unacceptable, right? So we've chosen terms over time in rubrics to again reinforce our philosophy of grading, even when we develop our rubrics. Okay. So now let's think about continuums of learning. How are they different? Or are they similar? And what I've noticed in the last 20 years is that we've been on a journey. And there was a lot of emphasis in the 90s and coming into 2000, 2010 on developing rubrics. What does that look like? How do you do that? How do you define those spaces? But along beside that, there was a slower evolution of continuums. Similar, but just different enough to make some notable differences here that we need to talk about. So I've defined a continuum of learning as each learner is on an individual journey, recognized by growth in the cognitive, physical, and affective domains. Learning progress can be compared to indicators, standards, or competencies that describe the knowledge, skills, and dispositions acquired by the individual over time. And they're usually marked by milestones or benchmarks. A continuum of learning allows the teacher and the learning to chart the learner's progress. Charting the learner's progress is one of those differential points here. So in looking at a few research studies, when we originally did this, we were anticipating people from a lot of different fields. And so I'm pulling in several different areas, but in this particular study, they were looking at using a standard-based curriculum. They created a developmental continuum for 320 students in physical education, ages 9 to 13 years old. They identified student exemplars, and that's really important when you're developing a continuum. Oftentimes in a class, when I'm sharing a big project that's due, and you may do the same thing, I will provide an example of a student who got the A. Or maybe they got a B and I provide some of my feedback on what it would have taken for them to have moved to the A. And of course, we get permission from the student to do that. That's providing an exemplar in a way. But providing an exemplar in a continuum of learning means you're providing exemplars at different stages or levels along the path for the student to be able to compare the work they're doing to the exemplars so that they can begin to chart their progress just as you're charting their progress. So in this particular study, they identified student exemplars based on 13 indicators of knowledge and skills. And during the course of the year of using their developmental continuums, they had offered, they explained to parents what they were doing, why they were doing it, and had said, if any of you at any time want us to translate the work we're doing into a grade, we'll be happy to do so. But over the course of the year, none of the parents and none of the students asked for a grade. They were happy to receive the feedback they were receiving, looking at and charting their growth on the continuum of learning because they were getting feedback. And we know that that's the critical piece here. It's timely, ongoing feedback for the learner so that they know how to improve their knowledge, skills, and dispositions. The other piece that they came to find was that there seemed to be greater intrinsic motivation for the students. Now, they didn't quantify this element, and that's what I would hope to see in a future study, and to note how many students, were they making more progress? Were they making less progress? But they said that they had noticed greater intrinsic motivation. They also made a note at the end of this article about the fact that personalized learning, which is what develops when you're working on a learning continuum, is also differentiated learning because it puts you in a place of having to chart everybody in their learning journey, in their learning path. And then based on where they start, you're going to want to push them to the next growth point, to the next milestone. So that means everybody's not working towards an assumed milestone at all times. Or the same milestone, I should say. Okay. Another study done in science, and I will say when I was getting ready for today, I was going back through and looking at what's been written about the most in the research related to continuums of learning. And the most prolific area or content area right now seems to be science. And I was really amazed, especially with educators looking at the next generation science standards. And they're talking about learning progressions, which is oftentimes a substituted word for continuums of learning. And this particular one, this study, they defined their learning progressions specifically as sequences of ordered descriptions that illustrate the learning pathways students can take to improve conceptual competence in science. They wanted to focus on the type of complex systems thinking their science students were doing between grades 8 through 12. They ended up with 44 students in their study, and they began to chart where they were initially, and then began to look at where they needed to push them to grow. But this was an initial validation of the progressions, the continuum that they were creating. And so I included it in our talk today because it provides a nice example if you're wanting to develop or create a continuum of learning. They've set out their procedures and steps within their methods of this study really well. And it's a nice example of how to develop a continuum of learning and what that can look like. I bring you one more. Again, this one's from high school. This is in an English class. And this was more of a descriptive study from a teacher describing what she had done and how she was learning about continuums of learning. So there wasn't that empirical research aspect of it. But I thought some of the information and the reflections she and the students made were worth noting here. So she provided a survey to her high school juniors, and she simply asked, what is success? Now, I don't know what you would say success is, but I don't think you would say it's getting grades in order to get into college. After all the work we've done on outcome-based learning, standards and competencies, you would hope that the language would be a little bit richer. But she said this was the predominant response from her juniors, was success was defined as getting the grades needed to get into college. So she had read, and this is a book I mentioned in the first rubric workshop, Transforming Classroom Grading by Robert Marzano. And he really challenges our notion of how we use grades and why we use grades. And here he provides a historical timeline from the early 2000s of how grades came to be such a dominant force in our education system. He goes back before grades were a dominant force in our education system to look at what were universities doing before grades. What were educators doing before grades? A lot more of it was narrative than what we have today. But he also provides, as he's questioning how we use grades in the education system and our allegiance to them, he also provides another way to look at it, and that is using a standards-based assessment framework. And that moves us in the direction of thinking about continuums of learning. And so I mentioned that today for that reason. So what this teacher did is not necessarily develop a continuum of learning, but she did a standards-based assessment in her high school classroom for writing. Instead of having her assignments at the top of her grade book, she listed the standards she wanted them to attain at the top of her grade book. So multiple assignments could be used to demonstrate attainment of a particular standard. That type of thinking is that transitional thinking we need to move to if we're going to move towards using continuums of learning. That it's less about a grade on this assignment and more about using multiple sources of evidence to demonstrate consistent, sustained knowledge and skills and dispositions on a particular standard or competency. And that's what a continuum of learning also enables us to do, is to benchmark those things. So she also asked, she did use a 1 to 10 point scale. She said in her school system, she had to do grades. She couldn't get away from it. And so she was caught in this, mental space of, I've got to keep my job, but I want to try this other way of doing my grading. And that was her compromise, to do the 1 to 10. This was a reflection of one of her students at the end of that year. And she asked them to write about the lack of having grades, but charting their progress and doing the feedback approach. And I thought what Quincy said was really important for us to think through. She said, I used to write for other people. I used to write for the grade. It's sad to say, but I did it often. My writing had become such a constricted and construed mess from staying within the confines of what I believed to be an A. It was not me. It was an attempt to please. No stream of consciousness because it's not grammatical. Okay. Times New Roman, type, 12-point font, no exceptions. Okay. This year, however, has been different. This year, I've seen writing treated as artwork. Pieces of prose treated as masterpieces. It's as if students expressing their innermost thoughts upon paper is too valuable a thing to have a letter stamped upon it. Taking us back to our Mona Lisa. This year, my writing skills have been honed, not labeled. They've been given suggestions for my writing and written feedback to strengthen my weak points. Instead of fearing the rejection associated with a B-, I've stepped off the precipice and taken risks. And from daily read-arounds to essential question workshops, I've learned to step out of my comfort zone and voice topics that speak to me. So if we go back, you see that she used to write for people. She used to write for the grade. We look back at what the students defined as success, getting the grades necessary to get into college. And then we began to see this transformation occurring, where now she begins to see the act of writing as an expression of herself, and she's willing to take risks. And guys, I don't know what your thoughts are about when learning occurs, but in my theory, when we have a little disequilibrium and we push ourselves beyond our comfort zones, that's when we see learning occur. And so instead of playing it safe, she went out and pushed, and she was able to demonstrate greater growth. So here we are, continuums of learning. What does this all mean for the university? Well, this conversation has been happening not just in schools, but also at the university level. And in many capacities, I brought some of my friends today. I know those of you that are online can't see these, but we've got using evidence of student learning to improve higher education by the National Institute for Learning Outcomes and Assessment. Some of my favorite authors related to higher education assessment are noted in this book. And then developing outcome-based assessment for learner-centered education, a faculty introduction by Amy Driscoll and Tor Wood is another one of my favorites. Good reads to take. So what resources have been explored? What does this look like? Well, it's been going on for about 15 years. There's been some solid work around learning outcomes and continuums of learning, as well as rubric development in higher education. And so if you've been with me before in an assessment talk, you've probably heard me talk about the degree qualifying profile grid. And you've probably heard me talk about the American Association of Colleges and Universities value rubrics or LEAP objectives. So the AACU's, American Association of Colleges and Universities value rubrics, or the LEAPs, are 16 rubrics centered around these elements: civic engagement, creative thinking, critical thinking, ethical reasoning, global learning, information literacy, inquiry and analysis, integrative thinking, intercultural knowledge, foundation and skills of lifelong learning, oral communication, problem solving, quantitative literacy, reading, teamwork, and written communication. Now, I brought with me today some examples of these rubrics, but I also have in a live text visitors pass all the links to examples of these as well. And so we will, I believe, Jennifer's provided that live text visitors pass for you. If you go to www.livetext.com and in the visitors pass section, if you put in the number 58708F93, this is the part about wearing these masks. You can't see what people are pronouncing. That visitors pass will take you to these resources. So what they've done is they've defined what are critical areas that should be assessed during a student's time at a university. They've looked at employer surveys. They've worked in consultation with faculty at universities. And these were the areas that were coming up most often. Now, you've probably heard of these rubrics before. because we've been using them here at SIU in our core curriculum for over 10 years. These have been a part of our assessment system in the first 2 years. What's not happened is an extension of these into our discipline areas and what this looks like within our disciplines. So let me give you just a small sample for those that don't have these in front of you. One of the, that shouldn't be DQP, it should be LEAP. One of the rubrics focuses on oral communication. And oral communication, the rubric has the elements for language, organization, delivery, central message, and supporting materials. Now, obviously, for a presentation, I couldn't get all the text on this slide and you'd be able to read any of it. So I chose just to put the text in for central message. But if you go to the handout that's in live text, you'll have access to all of the rubrics and you can see all of the elements defined. So in this rubric, one difference is you'll notice that instead of going from left to right, this one is going from right to left. They're putting their highest mark next to the elements. And that's another conversation about how you may or may not want to set up rubrics. You'll notice the point value, again, that's that compromise to justify for the grades, right? We've got a benchmark, 2 milestones, and then a capstone. The capstone truly is meant to be an expectation at the time of graduation with a bachelor's degree, not an expectation for the associate level. And that's something to keep in mind as well, because oftentimes when we see the value rubrics, we think of them as being just for the undergrads for the first 2 years and not as applicable for the second 2. But they are. They're still applicable for us. Notice the language. It follows rubric conventions. We've got the central message under benchmark can be deduced, but it's not explicitly stated. The central message is basically understandable, but not often repeated and not memorable. So what happens in rubrics, what we tend to do is what we say what the piece has or does not have. What does it include or not include? We're putting those value statements in there of, is it good, bad, or ugly? When you begin to think about continuums of learning, you want to have a shift in your language. You want to stop using some of those it has and doesn't have, but just describing what it is, how it stands alone as it is, okay? So this is an example of a rubric. There's 16 of these. They cross disciplines. As you can tell, the language is somewhat generalized, and they're in those areas. So let's look at the next piece, the degree qualifying profile. This comes out of the National Institute for Learning Outcomes and Assessment. NIOLA is at the University of Illinois, and they have a group there, a center there on assessment. They serve as a consulting group for universities around the United States and looking at outcome-based assessment at universities. They've been here several times at my request to meet with administrators and faculty about their work with the degree qualifying profile. The DQP is actually a continuum of learning. So I wanted to put forth the LEAP rubrics, but also to have us look at how they're similar to and different from a continuum of learning. So in this, the DQP focuses on specialized knowledge, broad integrative knowledge, intellectual skills, applied and collaborative learning, and civic and global learning. The benchmarks or milestones are noted at the associate's level, the bachelor's level, and the master's level. So those are endpoints in their progress. So this is an example, again, staying with that communication piece. We're thinking about communicative fluency. This is how they define communicative fluency at the associate level, the bachelor's, and the master's. And I'll give you just a minute to read through those descriptors. How does that feel different than the rubric language?
There's a definite qualitative distinction.
Mhm.
So, you know, at the bachelor's level, it isn't just more of what was done at the associate level.
It's a deeper, more applied use of what they were learning. So it's almost as if we were to think about even Bloom's taxonomy. We could say some of the skills at the associate's level are appropriate and presented in a positive way, but they're being expected to do more application and go deeper in their thinking when they get to the bachelor's. And then even more critical thinking as they move up to the master's level, right? What's important here again is the fact that somebody at the associate's level, the language that's being used there, they're not going to feel less than if they're at that level. Or what's stated in the middle, they can stand proud on what they've got there in the middle. Okay, let's keep going. So here at SIU, we also have a set of learning outcomes. We had a committee, a task force that worked on these in 2018 and 19. And ours were built from, we started off looking at and identifying what are the knowledge, skills, and dispositions we expect of our SIU college graduates. What should they know and be able to do by the time they graduate? This is for the bachelor's level. We then did a qualitative analysis of all of their assessment plans, and I'll share that a little bit of that study with you in just a moment. And it ended up being 7 different learning outcomes for SIU at the bachelor's level: civic and global engagement, diversity and inclusivity, creative and critical inquiry, communicative and technical literacy, ethical reasoning and professional integrity, disciplinary knowledge and application, emotional intelligence, and teamwork. Now, let me tell you a little bit about how we got to this point. Our other rubric and other outcomes here. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly and how these evolved, and I'm just going to do a downstream. So this was our process. Our task force was made up of people from all the different colleges across campus, as well as our student service programs. We defined knowledge, skills, and attitudes we expect of our graduates. We looked at research related to what our employers expect of graduates. Interesting here, the highest expectation is able to effectively communicate orally and critical thinking and analytical reasoning. So we use this information. We talked about why we wanted to establish institutional learning outcomes. One of those purposes being that at the moment, we have our SIU mission statement. This was back then. We had a plan for the Higher Learning Commission, our institution effectiveness, and then our program effectiveness, but the three were not joined. And so we saw institutional learning outcomes as a way to bring together those three entities, our mission, our institutional effectiveness, and our program effectiveness by establishing a language that's common amongst all of us. This is our mission statement. The pieces that were most applicable are noted in red. Access and opportunity, student success, and future leaders. We looked at what data are we collecting as assessments, demographic scholarships, learning outcomes, assessment plans that each program submits. And we also collect information about employment and community impact. We began to, again, define what is the Saluki standard? What makes them a Saluki? What makes them different from being a bobcat or a cougar or a bulldog or whatever? What makes us special? And so we were having that conversation. We looked at expectations by the Higher Learning Commission. We looked at examples from other universities, Cornell, the University of Hawaii, University of Texas at Arlington. I believe within this PowerPoint, these are hyperlinked to their actual learning outcomes for their institution, so you can go back through that later. We began to do this qualitative analysis, looking at program goals and student learning outcomes stated in their assessment plans. As a task force, we were looking at codes and subcodes, ranked the codes, clustered the codes. Here's an example of a spreadsheet used during that time. So CASA was the College of Applied Arts and Sciences at the time, College of Science, education's there, engineering. So you can also see along the bottom some of the codes that were beginning to emerge: communication, quantitative literacy, research, ethics. Here were some of our codes as they were emerging and some of the subcodes that fell underneath them. The numbers in parentheses show how many times these terms or items within someone's assessment showed up. So communication, you can see, had a lot of hits. Discipline knowledge had a lot of hits. Application of discipline knowledge. What's interesting to me is diversity showed up as only being hit 8 times. And that was a huge concern and red flag. We'll talk about that in a minute. We looked at sample pie charts based on codes. We took each of our evolving codes and looked at how they were valued within the assessment plans of each college, how often they were being assessed in each college. We looked at ranking the codes. I had 2 different groups at the time. The Institutional Learning Outcome Task Force ranked our codes in this manner. Our campus-wide assessment committee, what's interesting is these are administrators, and they ranked our codes in this way. And I just find it interesting, the left side is faculty and student service personnel, the right side's administration, and you see things fall out just a little differently, but similarities between the two as well. Then we began to cluster our codes, noting where there was overlap or common affinities amongst them. So you can see here, there might have been a code for discipline, application, and interdisciplinary. Discipline knowledge, application of discipline knowledge came together to then become disciplinary knowledge and application. And then that's when we ended up with, or how we ended up with our 7 institutional learning outcomes. Now, this was our committee. I'll give you just a second to give appreciation to everybody that worked on this for that entire year. And at the conclusion of that year, at the end of this qualitative project or process, we had approval from Faculty Senate. They voted on our institutional learning outcomes for the bachelor's degree program, that this would be our set of outcomes. So, taking us back to our conversation here. So where do we go from here? What does this look like for us? Where do we take this information? Well, one of the places that we can go is we can begin to do some backwards mapping. We can begin to take our institutional learning outcomes and measures, take what we know now about continuums of learning, and begin to define for ourselves within our disciplines, within our programs, what does this look like at the freshman level, the sophomore level, the junior level, and the senior level? What do we want to be the elements on this left side? Now, what I've pulled from are some of the elements from the value rubrics, from the LEAP objectives. So going back to those, now what I would not want to see us do is to go back and make this a rubric at this point, because these are milestones, these are benchmarks where we're noting their progress. So we want to be able to use that qualitative language that we saw up here to help us define what this looks like at these different levels. And so in education, we talk about backwards mapping. We talk about starting with the end in mind. And I would recommend that we would start at the senior level, and then we would map backwards to look at what do we expect of those freshmen. I would expect that we would want to pull together exemplars for each of our institutional learning outcomes, and that we would then begin to develop that continuum of learning. So you may be sitting there and thinking, boy, that's a big project, Christie. Yeah, that's a big project. What does that mean for you in your classes? In your classes, knowing that these resources exist, knowing that there is a degree qualifying profile with language that already defines at length in a continuum of learning what students might be expected to do if they're engaging diverse perspectives or analytic inquiry or ethical reasoning, that we have resources we can tap into to help us build language for learnings of continuum. If I were to jump back into this right now, I would also pull from the LEAP rubrics. I can pull the has and does not have out of here, and I can begin to think about some of the phrases that really begin to look more at what do they look like at these same levels, so that I'm not starting from scratch. Now, I also at this point would remind us that we always have to think about our context and where we are. We still have to give grades. We still have to submit a grade at the end of our courses. And so rubrics, in a way, still provide that source of information and feedback for us. But I would challenge us to pay attention to the fact that competency-based education, standards-based assessments, continuums of learning are being discussed in education. They're not to be ignored. And if we want to be ahead of the game, ahead of the conversation, we should begin to be a part of the conversation. We should begin to be a part of defining what this looks like for us in our disciplines. What is a continuum of learning? Like I said, previously, the sciences have been doing the most work as it relates to continuums of learning. Some of the best examples and articles are coming out of medicine right now. Medicine, the medical field, nursing programs, doctor programs have moved towards a competency-based model. So it's more about you get to move on in the program when you've demonstrated a set of competencies, not just because you got a grade in a course. And we've all seen, at least in our area with the pandemic, the impact of grade inflation. what other factors influence the grades that we give students? Even though we'd like to say other things don't influence us and that we're objective, we're not. We're not objective. And so on that front, would the conversation for the students and for us be a better conversation if it were about their progress, what they've attained in moving towards a particular competency, standard, or outcome, and what they need to continue to grow, as opposed to arguing with them about points on an assignment. I don't know about you, but that is one of my pet peeves in life, is to have assessed something, given it a value, and a student come up to me and want to argue points. Like, wait a minute. Have you been doing this for 30 years? Let's talk about that, okay? I was being generous. Take it. So as we move forward, as competencies begin to influence, and these conversations are also happening in the public schools, as states are beginning to look at as well, it's just an evolution of a conversation. And given where we are with the pandemic, this is a wonderful time for us to be talking about what competencies do these students, whether it's high schoolers or college students, what do they have, and accurately mark where they are, as opposed to just wanting to pass them on to keep that forward projection going to the end of their program. I feel like we've been caught up in this cycle, in this grading scheme, in this system, and it's not serving us or our students as well as it should, or maybe as well as we think it does. So I encourage you all to think about Emerson's quote, "Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail." Now, I chose a picture where there's a semi-path because I wanted you to know that you're not breaking down the bushes completely. You do have resources out there. This is being done. There are conversations. It's just a matter of when will we start to engage in that conversation with them. All right, you've been attentive. You've been great. We've got 3 minutes maybe. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I can see that this was kind of in the process of thinking of some of the elementary schools when they were doing writing portfolios, and they would that writing portfolio would go with that student throughout the whole grade. Remember that time of
I was a part of that.
I was a part of that, right?
Yep.
And it even went to their middle school, and after that, of course, our elementary teachers, we didn't know what happened to it after that. But I can remember us kind of thinking in this path of thinking as we were doing those writing portfolios every year.
That's what got me, that's where I began with some of this thinking, was exactly that. I was on a report card committee in my district near Atlanta when I was a teacher, and we had been a part of a huge research project in looking at those writing stages and identifying them kindergarten to 12th grade with exemplars. And then having those exemplars posted in my classroom on my wall, and my students could take their writing samples and compare them to the exemplars, and we could talk about, okay, this is your portfolio. Here are 3 or 4 writing samples of the last 2 weeks. What stage are we at right now? And what do we need to do next to get to the next stage? And having that conversation.
It wasn't a grade. There were no points on the rubric about it. It was just a narrative, a conference you would have with the student to give them feedback on how they're going to get to the next level of their writing.
And a lot of these studies that are talking about continuums of learning, are talking about conferences with students, about setting goals, about reflection and the student charting their progress along the way. But they also emphasize the feedback, how the feedback's coming back to the student, how often, and what that looks like. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Well, if we don't have any other questions, then we'll round out today. I do hope that you were able to, I'll share my screen and show you how to do that visitor's pass if you're not familiar with that process. If you go to livetext.com and in the visitor's pass, if you put in 58708 F93, it will take you to a place that says Rubric Workshop Series. Within that series, you can see you actually get, hey, this is an infomercial. You actually get 5 for the price of 1 today. How about it? Because we did 5 sessions before. You get the first session, second, third, fourth session, and now the final concluding session as well. Dr. Corinne did our second, third, and fourth, I believe. I did our first and last, I believe, if I remember correctly. But all the materials, so the institutional learning outcomes PowerPoint is here, your Beyond Rubrics Continuums of Learning PowerPoint's here. You have direct links here to an assessment literacy continuum. This is a continuum that lets you assess, I'll go to it quickly, lets you assess your readiness and your assessment literacy, looking at continuums of learning. The value rubrics we talked about are linked here, your degree qualifying profile here. The articles that were highlighted are noted here. And then you have additional attachments down there. So all the materials are here for you to enjoy later. Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much.